Hello and welcome to Conversations with Non-Catholic Christians, this show that I only do occasionally because I spend most of my time talking to Catholics, but today I am joined by Paul from Thinking Christian. Paul, what's up?
Hey, not much. Been really excited to have this conversation and honestly been trying to stay warm. We've been having the freeze out here. But other than that, yeah, just great to be here on the channel. Thanks so much, Kevin, for hosting. And yeah, excited to have a fun dialogue.
Yeah, me too. So just to kind of, I guess, fill the audience in a little bit on how this conversation happened, I guess, is so you made a video responding to one of my videos about morality. Um, I made a community post on my page where I just said, "Hey, everybody, go check out this video. How cool is this that somebody made a response video to one of my older ones?" Because the only other person who's actually ever responded to one of my videos is a friend of mine, Kyle Whittington. He's a Catholic
Oh,
apologist.
okay.
So you were the first person who I didn't already know who made a response video to me. So in a lot of ways, you were my first like real one. So I thought that was cool. I made the community post. You reached. We wound up talking in the comments. We set it up over email. So I guess my first question for you is, how'd you find my video about morality? My channel, I describe it as a Catholic channel. Obviously, I'm not Catholic anymore. But I find that the majority of my audience is Catholic, and you're not. But you responded to one of my videos anyway. So how'd you find it, and what made you want to respond?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the YouTube algorithm recommended your video to me. And one of the things that's really interesting about the YouTube algorithm is I think it's figured out that I am what people call, and people have described me this, I'm a negative polarity responder, which basically means I tend to like looking at content that is particularly like challenging or disconfirming. So I'm a Christian, but most of my YouTube recommended videos are actually from atheists and counter apologists because that tends to be the stuff that I click on more than just other Christian apologetics stuff, because that tends to be, I don't know, I think I just enjoy the sort of listening to different perspectives. I'm like, if I already believe this or I already know this, I don't need to watch it as much. So I think the algorithm recommended your video to me, and then you just kept kind of like coming up in different things. Like I would see you sometimes in the comments on Joe Schmid's videos. I watch his channel quite a bit, and a few other places. And not only did I like your video, but the video that you wrote about that you had on morality and gastronomical realism, I had never heard of that paper before, but that example is often used quite a bit. People like talking. I've seen some Christian apologists say, "Oh, morality, if it's not real, is just the same as like liking different flavors of ice cream." So I thought that was a really cool paper, and I was like, "Oh, I'm so glad you found this because I'm just really interested." I like that example, and I like the paper a lot, and I liked what you described about it. So I just thought it would be like a fun video to sort of give some thoughts to. I've kind of given a few response videos to other topics on morality just because for some weird happenstance, even though I don't really have a background in philosophy, I do know some meta ethics. So sometimes I enjoy exploring these topics. It's something that I find very interesting. So I guess I just kind of came across it due to the YouTube suggestion, and I like the video. I watch it. I think I've seen some of your other videos as well, but I tend to really like the sort of moral arguments. It tends to be where I'm just most interested in. So that's kind of how I found it. And you seem like a cool person that would enjoy the dialogue. So I was hoping maybe at some point we could have a discussion like this, and I'm glad we were able to do that.
Me too. So Kyle's ears must have been ringing because Kyle is here. And so Kyle, don't rewind. I'll just repeat it. What I said was, I think that Paul is the first person to respond to one of my videos who didn't already know me before he made the response video, because obviously Kyle, we've had our back and forths, but Paul, I think, is the first person who didn't know me first. And then I also just want to highlight that Lance is here, Dr. Lance Bush. And I'm very excited that he's here because this is definitely up his alley. And he specifically says he wants to talk to you, Paul, about meta ethics. So I'm really happy that Lance is here.
Oh, that would be cool. I didn't realize, I think Lance was the person who went on Joe Schmid's channel to talk about some other meta ethical topic, and that's really interesting. No, that'd be really cool. And I think, Lance, you had mentioned in the comments on one of my videos of hopefully getting to talk to one of the Christian moral anti-realists or non-realists would be very interesting, just because that's not a perspective I'm exposed to. So yeah, that would be really cool.
And I have a question for you. Do you think that my videos, and this is like so out of order, but do you think that my videos are popping up in your feed because the YouTube algorithm classifies me as a like atheist YouTube channel? Or because I find that a lot of Catholics will comment on my videos being like, why is this Protestant video popping up in my YouTube feed? I'm not a Protestant. Um, I'm making videos that are critical of like Marian apparitions and stuff like that. But I find it like funny that it pops up in other Catholic like other Catholic algorithms, and then they think that I'm a Protestant. But if it popped up in your algorithm, does that mean that YouTube considers me to be atheist?
So actually I don't know. Are you Catholic? Are you agnostic, atheist? I don't even know.
Agnostic. I call myself agnostic.
Okay.
Yeah. But I'm ex-Catholic, and so I grew up trad Catholic, which is like a very specific kind of Catholic.
Like traditional. Okay, I think
Yeah.
I've heard of some people who are in the traditional Catholic areas. Maybe you'll find this interesting, Kevin. So one of my lab mates we have the same PhD advisor. He recently converted to Catholicism, and he's been teaching me a lot about Catholicism as well. And there were a lot of misconceptions and things I didn't know. So maybe part of it has been me also looking at kind of like Catholic stuff on YouTube as well as like atheist and agnostic stuff on YouTube, and your channel happens to be maybe almost in some ways at the intersection of both of those. And I mean, like I said, I don't know of anyone else who is like an ex-Catholic who like talks about the kind of stuff, at least in the way you do. So you seem, I mean, I don't know, maybe there are other people out there, but I just haven't seen them.
There kind of aren't, and that's kind of why I started my channel. Because unfortunately, like ex-Catholics kind of have like a reputation for like never having taken their faith seriously to begin with, and like I get it, like that is the case for a lot of folks. But I'm somebody who did take it seriously. Like I wanted to be a priest. Like I was in it, man. Like I was the real deal, I guess. And so I didn't find like there was nobody who was talking about this stuff from like an ex-Catholic perspective. I feel like the only kinds of like ex-Catholics on YouTube were like the Joe Schmidt kinds, because like Joe Schmidt is ex-Catholic in a sense.
Oh,
But
I didn't realize that.
yeah, Joe Schmidt's
Okay.
ex-Catholic, but I don't think he ever took it that seriously. I mean, let me not speak for Joe Schmidt. He wasn't a traditionalist like I was. Thank you, Kyle. Kyle says Kevin's work is extremely useful for getting one out of one's echo chamber. That's kind of how I see my channel. Honestly, is like my goal is frankly not to like deconvert anybody. I do not care one iota if I do not deconvert anybody, but I do want to like de-radicalize people. And I think that there are a lot of radicalized traditional Catholics, and there's even a term for it. They call them rad trads. There's a lot
Oh,
of
okay.
rad trads out there. And rad trads can be like really nasty, really nasty people. And so my goal is to stop people from being nasty people by hopefully de-radicalizing them. And so that's kind of like how I see my channel working. And I hadn't found any content like that. So I kind of started, I guess that's why I started my channel, right? It's like,
But that's so important because you're feeling like a niche that's like really important. I think also a lot of the people that I find that are ex-Catholics tend to be very okay. I don't take this the wrong way, but some of them tend to be very like angry or bitter, and you don't seem like the kind of person who's like you seem to be very rational. And I understand that, but it's difficult for people like who are on the outside like me to say like how do I know this person who's an ex-Catholic isn't just extrapolating from their bad experience, like as opposed to actually thinking through this, and that's just interesting to me, to be honest.
yeah, I almost said I have you fooled when you said that I'm not. So um, I was angry for a while. And Jason asked, "Is that an icon that I see?" And yes, that's actually from Kyle. I've had it for a long time. The icon behind me right there, that's Saint Nicholas. So, but I was angry for a while, and part of why I was angry is because I was kind of strong-armed into getting married when I was 22. And me and my wife were not ready to get married. But we had a 3-month engagement, and then we got married, and then we promptly moved 700 miles away. And so that was like a pretty awful experience for both of us. And so we were very angry for a long time. And honestly, part of this channel was kind of like, hey, let me work through this stuff. You know what I mean? Like, let me process everything that I went through. Now, there was a gap of, so let's see, I started my channel in 2021. No, 2022. Yep. Started my channel in 2022 and got married in 2018. So there was 4 years in between. And I think I did a decent, hopefully I did a little bit of healing over those 4 years. But I was, I was angry for a while. But I decided to try to channel that into something a little bit more productive than just pure anger, and then if I can make it something more productive, then everybody wins. I win because I get to process some of these emotions, and hopefully people who are radicalized can win because they can become de-radicalized. So that's kind of the hope for the channel.
And I think that's really important because let's say somebody who's Catholic looks at your channel and they say, okay, maybe this is somebody who perhaps had anger, but it kind of debunks this like narrative where it's like, oh, the only people who aren't Catholics are people who are just harboring this bitterness period and they're unable to be rational. I think I heard from a girl in my class, one of the classes I'm teaching today, who literally said she was brought up in, and she's not Catholic, I don't think, but in a Christian community where she was told all non-believers were like stupid and that they were like people of the devil or something. And I was like, like she appreciated the fact that I'm teaching a class on like objections to Christianity. And there's like a third of the class is Christian, a third of the class is agnostic, and a third of the class is atheist. And it's like, I'm so happy about that because it's like, really, it's been a productive class so far. But I was like trying to tell her like, wow, like I can't even imagine how just like difficult that would be because you're coming into these conversations not thinking there's like merit in or some reason somebody else could believe what they believe or not believe what they don't believe. And I think sometimes it's better for me, at least this is something I found, at least after kind of maybe becoming a Christian more recently, is just like really dropping the sort of judgment on that and being like, let me see what I can learn from this, as opposed to like trying to presuppose their intentions without even like listening. Like, I think that's not always a healthy, at least in my view, that's not a healthy attitude to come to the conversation with. So
I 100% agree. And the traditionalist movement is really bad at what you just described. So we wouldn't only like make fun of non-Catholics, we would make fun of all the other Catholics who weren't trad. So if you went to church services that were said in English instead of said in Latin, that's because you don't take your faith seriously. And you're probably a little stupid. And if you just knew better, you would go to mass in Latin. But you don't know better because you're dumb. That was kind of the mindset of the trad movement. And it's it takes a lot to especially when you're raised in it. The trad movement is weird because it exploded in popularity over the past 5 years, I would say, especially since COVID. The movement has probably tripled over the past 5 years and probably doubled since COVID. I think that a lot of the converts to the trad movement, and when I say converts, like a Catholic who was Novus Ordo but is now going to the trad movement, isn't going to have the same experience that I did. And I say that because hopefully these people who are kind of converting to the trad movement will help to de-radicalize the trad movement. I hope. Because the original trad people, like my grandparents founded the trad church that I went to. It was super toxic. Like we had somebody who was in jail because he bombed an abortion clinic level. Like,
oh, yeah, interesting.
Like, when I say radical, I really do mean radical. People advocating for slavery, like slavery is a good thing.
Really?
Yeah. People advocating to take away women's rights to vote. Yeah. I was taught, so I went to school in the basement of that church, and like in 5th grade, I was taught that women's suffrage was a mistake, like in school. This thing is best described as like a homeschool co-op because like my teachers were like the parents of the other parishioners and stuff like that. But I grew up like very radical, like very, very radical.
And I hate to say it, I don't want to offend anyone, but it almost sounds kind of like a cult or cultish. It's like we have to shelter ourselves from other people who could corrupt. I don't know. That was just kind of the reaction that I've got. I've just never heard of anything like that before. So it's like fascinating, but also like really sad, because as I've been learning more about Catholicism, like what I've found is that I had a lot of like very wrong misconceptions about what Catholics believed and who Catholics were. You'll find this funny. My mom, she converted when I was young from like, I guess, Christianity to Seventh-day Adventism, which is like Christian. I mean, people argue all the time about whether Seventh-day Adventists are like Christians or not. And I think, like anything, there are some people who are more radicalized than others, but they are the ones who take the Bible very, very literally. And I think in a certain way, there were certain things that I was exposed to that really pushed me away from not just Christianity, but organized religion as a whole. For a very long time, I think I was like, this stuff is harmful, and it's just interesting that that's in some ways a parallel. Some of the things that they say and the way that they look at things kind of parallels some of the things you're saying. Although I don't think I ran into anyone who would advocate for like slavery or anything about women's suffrage or anything like that. So and no offense to any of the Seventh-day Adventists in there, yeah.
And Kyle is joking, but Kyle said that he thinks that suffrage in general was a mistake. Bring back the monarchy. And Kyle's joking, but that is a real thing within the trad movement. Like, people think that like legitimately, like, we should have a Catholic king in the United States, and like the state religion should be Catholicism. That's called integralism, and it's a whole other thing. But that's how I grew up. So it's pretty, it's pretty weird, pretty different. So anyway, that's kind of my whole channel. And so I guess some of my early videos that I was doing was me kind of sharing some of the papers and some of the ideas that like really changed my mind. And I was a moral realist. Obviously, I was a moral realist when I was religious. Although I shouldn't say obviously, because there are Christians like Dave Paulman who Dave Paulman is a Christian moral anti-realist. But regardless, I was a moral realist Catholic for a long time. Then I wasn't Catholic anymore, but I still considered myself a moral realist for a long time, until I read that paper about gastronomic realism. And I read that paper right around the same time that I started getting into a lot of Dr. Lance Bush's stuff too. And so that kind of wound up prompting me to even drop the moral realism moniker as well. So I guess on both fronts, I'm now like, I'm not a Catholic realist, if you want to call it that. And I'm also not a moral realist. Your current stance on morality is that you would consider yourself a moral realist still, right?
Yeah, I would definitely consider myself a moral realist. I don't think I'm, because it's interesting. Like, when we say moral realism, that's an
Thanks
interesting
for the correction, Lance.
point. Yeah, Lance. Like, I guess you're right. If you're a moral skeptic versus an anti-realist, that's an interesting. It's kind of like a moral agnostic or something. I don't know. I'm just thinking like in terms of terminology. Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, Lance corrected me on my response to you, where I think I kind of equivocated error theory and anti-realism a little bit. But I would consider myself a moral realist. But I don't think all moral propositions are factual per se, because I think some are like asking the wrong question. So I think sometimes like the question, is killing wrong, I think is a bit too broad to say that's a true or a false statement, because there are some instances in which I believe it might be justified in terms of self-defense. But I believe that there are like moral propositions do have like intellectual content. It's not like, I'm not an emotivist where I believe like if I say, rape is wrong, I'm just saying like boo rape or anything like that. I believe I'm actually saying something that is like a fact, a true, that can evaluate to true, or that I could be wrong about. So in that sense, yes, I would consider myself a moral realist. But what I should say is, and you may find this interesting, it was reading the work of certain Catholic philosophers, in particular G.E.M. Anscombe, Alistair MacIntyre, I guess Charles Taylor to a certain extent, but Charles Taylor, I think, I don't know. He's very postmodern, so I think some of his views are somewhat unorthodox to a lot of people. I find it very interesting. So for me, it was Catholic view that took me from moral realism as more of a Kantian deontologist to moral realism as in kind of like a virtue ethicsy kind of way. And that's where the whole teleology, the whole purpose piece came in, which I'm sure you picked up on. And I'll admit I found those books and those articles very compelling to me. I think there were some problems where I'm like, that were difficult to me to answer with deontology. So yes, I'm still like a moral realist. I do believe moral propositions are wrong, but the way in which they could be true perhaps is a little bit different, I've found over the last couple of years, than I used to think.
Um, I'd be super interested to kind of get your thoughts on like a teleological framing for morality as somebody who didn't grow up Catholic, because I grew up Catholic. So we didn't, it's not like I learned what teleology was when I was 7. You know what I mean? Like we weren't, but like the seeds were there. And then like, I think that we did probably talk about teleology in like, 8th grade or something like that, probably. And we were learning about Thomas Aquinas and stuff like that in school. And now I'm reading this book right now. I'm going to put it on screen just right here real quick, just to show you what it looks like. But I don't know if I can't tell if you guys can actually see what is on the screen, but oh no, it's a little, let me kind of bring it down like this. So it's called The Unnecessary Science. That's the name of the book. And the book is about natural law. And so the whole book is kind of like a response to Ed Feser. I don't know if you're familiar with Ed Feser's work, or like David Oderberg, but Feser and Oderberg Feser's Catholic. I think Oderberg is Catholic. I don't remember, but they both are very like, hey, morality is objective because it is teleological in nature, and because there are facts about the matter about like what it is for, like what is good for a human to do. Like just as how like it is good for a squirrel to like gather acorns, like that is an objective fact. Well, that means that it's also an objective fact. Like morality is an objective fact, just like it is an objective fact that it is good for a squirrel to gather acorns. So yeah, sorry, that was like a whole big tangent, but I remember growing up thinking that teleology made sense, but I think only probably because that's like the only, like it's all I knew. And then I remember being like in my late teens and early 20s and being like, I don't know that morality is really teleological in nature. Like I'm not sure that I agree that it's wrong not to use a biological like any kind of organ for its intended purpose. Like I don't think that's wrong per se. So I guess I'd be interested just to hear your off the cuff kind of thoughts about teleology. Like, do you find it intuitive? Because I think I find it counterintuitive.
That's a good question, and I'll admit maybe part of the reason I find it so intuitive has been some of the stuff that I've learned in my own work. So I had to take a class last year on optimization theory, and optimization, it was a super technical high level math class, but optimization is literally like teleological. Like here is your objective function, and you seek to find the maximum point that maximizes this particular function that is your goal. And under this, in this circumstance, you can have a solution exist and you can find it. In that way, teleology existed, but I think what was so interesting is I used to think about morality in a way that was not teleological at all. And I think this is, and Alistair McIntyre would agree, when he wrote After Virtue, which is the book that really did change my mind, he was not a Catholic. He converted to Catholicism a little bit later. He started his life as a Protestant. He was atheist agnostic for like a very long time. And then later in his life, he converted to Catholicism. But I think After Virtue, after he wrote that, really kind of pushed him in that direction. And he's on this long line of, and you may know this, so I don't mean to be preaching to the choir here, but this long line of people that are like analytic Thomists. So they're like the people who take the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. And this includes people like Anthony Kenny, who I think was even an atheist, or I guess he was an agnostic technically, but who leaned atheist, who the Catholic Church like gave him all these awards because of his contributions to this Thomistic view. And what McIntyre once said was, I came to accept analytic Thomism after trying to and failing to convince my students that it was false, was what he said. Very interesting. He's a very interesting, colorful guy, and a fun read for sure. But I think what G.M. Anscombe and then McIntyre pointed out was, how do we how do we come to ground moral stuff? Like, what is morality? Like you said, what is morality really about? And the utilitarians or the consequentialists are going to say morality is really about harm. And I took, I don't have a background in philosophy. I took one
Me
moral
neither.
philosophy class.
Me neither.
Okay. It makes me feel a little bit better.
I'm an
The fact
engineer
that
by education.
yeah, same here.
Cool.
I'm a double E. Wait, what?
Chemie.
Okay, nice.
We're
So
cousins.
I took yeah, exactly. We're cousins. That's so cool. So I took a philosophy class because I had to take, distribution breadth requirements at university. So I took an ethics class with George Scher, who's actually a pretty well-known ethicist apparently. Like, I've talked to people who actually know of him and some of the work he did on fairness. And I think as I took that class, I saw a lot of problems with this sort of utilitarian consequentialist view, where it led to things that were unintuitive to me. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe that's not what morality is about. And I think I was always kind of a Kantian, and this should make sense because my family's like, my dad's side of the family is like very German. So they would have been exposed to these ideas. And I think my dad is like a very hardcore kind of Kantian guy. And I think I accepted that. But the thing that I found compelling was McIntyre's point that the thing that caused these things to fail was trying to ground morality in reason itself and not in terms of a goal. And the point that McIntyre made that was compelling to me is you have human nature as it is. And to get from human nature as it is to human nature as it ought to be, and not necessarily like using like biology in terms of intended purpose, but basically like morality involves prescriptive or ought-based claims. And as I started thinking more about or reflecting more on morality, what I realized is, in my view, utilitarianism or deontology both kind of smuggle in these kind of ought-based claims, but they don't really justify it on the grounds of reason that they claim to. And it would work in the context of a place where everyone agrees with you. Like, if everyone agrees that, yeah, we should maximize utility, then you accept it. But that's not necessarily like, I would say, like a logical reason, in the sense that there are people that believe that animal suffering should be included. And to say human, utilitarians or consequentialists should end at humans or should also include animals, that's not a question you can decide from a moral place. There almost needs to be like which one should we or ought we try to optimize? Which of these two is the thing that morality is about? And how do we get that how do we bridge the is ought gap? I think that was where I found to be the teleological piece to be important in my view. And I think I also came to accept kind of a virtue ethics-y approach, in terms of like ethics being something we practice, as opposed to it just being based on the consequences or just being based on this set of rules we can write down. So I just said a lot of stuff.
No, that was all good. In terms of like the is ought stuff, so let me kind of sketch how I see teleology, and then I guess I'll just see if you agree, disagree, whatever. I don't necessarily see that teleology actually gets us any closer to bridging the is-ought gap. And I guess the reason I say that is because all that teleology can tell us to do, all that teleology can really say is like, hey, it would be like in line with a squirrel's nature to gather nuts. And that's how we define good. Good just means like in line with your nature. Great.
Okay, that's a good point. I see exactly what you're saying. I think the way I thought about this, because I agree with you, right? Just because, it is the case that this is, I think this could easily fall into the sort of naturalistic fallacy of this is the way squirrels are, but how do we get the ought to be from, like, how do we even get this ought? And I think my idea comes from the idea of like, more like, I guess you could argue like creation, like what are things designed for the purpose of doing, and is it in line with a sort of, I guess you could say, a design plan or not? And in this particular way, like what Aristotle talked about was like the purpose of a knife is to cut. So imagine if like a knife was like, well, I don't care about what you made me for. I'm just going to do what I want to do. The knife is free to do this, and that's totally fine. But if I created the knife and I said this knife is to cut, other people and other knives, if they were, conscious sentient things, could all look around and say objectively whether or not this knife was behaving in accordance with the purpose that I designed it for. And I guess in that sense, it would be independent. It wouldn't be an emotive, or it wouldn't be like a local thing. It would be like, in some ways, the fact that I created it gave me some level of authority to say, or like me saying what its purpose was isn't just arbitrary and isn't just my emotion, because I created it for this particular purpose, for this particular goal. And I think the way I found this to be an interesting moral argument is connecting this to like, okay, if God created all this stuff, then if he created humans like for a specific purpose, then perhaps we can actually have a conversation about what humans were created for, and we can then know whether or not somebody is behaving in accordance with the sort of design plan that God had or not. Now, I don't think most moral questions can be answered this way. I think some people take it way too far and they think, well, is this what a human being ought to be doing? Like, I'm actually very broad. I'm like, well, maybe humans were designed to like have a relationship with God and love each other and be happy with each other and sing kumbaya. I don't know, something very general like this. But then in general, you can start having an interesting conversation about things that are morally bad. They're bad because the person is not sort of behaving in accordance with this sort of plan that they said. I don't know if that answers your question, or if that, I'm worried I'm just kind of like repeating the same thing and not going anywhere with it. But
you are not just repeating the same thing and going nowhere with it, because Anton says that you're doing a very good job articulating teleology. So you're definitely yeah. I guess I guess my thing here is that like we can go as far as to say that like teleology gets us to the point of we can act in accord with our natures or not in accord with our natures, but I still don't think I have anything that says we ought to act in accord with our natures. Like, why ought I not act in accord with my nature? And like, as far as I can tell, I don't think teleology actually like answers that question. Like the is ought bridge still hasn't been constructed, I guess.
I think I see what you're saying, because what you're kind of saying is like, why ought I behave in a way that I ought to be?
well, so not quite, because then I think we've kind of smuggled an ought into teleology already. Like, but
Okay.
teleology isn't telling us how we ought to be. Teleology is telling us how we ought to be if we want to act in accord with our natures. Like, so hey, like a proper function under a teleological perspective would say that, you know, the teeth are for chewing food. They are not for gripping my phone. Okay, that's great. So it is in accord with my nature to use my teeth to chew food. It is not in accord with my nature to pick up my phone with my teeth. Great. Why ought I not pick up my phone with my teeth?
I think maybe where I would ask a question is, where does the nature piece come into this? Because one could argue that, because you're saying like by its nature, and I'm particularly saying like, I think like I would be careful if I was to make a claim about the way things are, because that seems to be a different thing than an ought. So are you saying like teeth ought to be used for chewing because they were designed for this purpose? Or what would be the is and the ought in that case?
Yeah, so I guess two different things here. So Aristotle actually believed that anything that can't even be like categorized has like a form, a nature. So like there is a nature of a Texas Rangers fan. Like they have a nature that is specific. And so like there would be things like it would be according to a Texas Rangers fan nature to go root for the Texas Rangers, and it would be against their nature to go root for any other sports team or whatever. And like that might sound weird to modern audiences, but Aristotle firmly believed that like if a thing can be like if there is some universal to which individuals belong, then that thing has a nature and a form. And so because teeth have some kind of teeth nature about them, like, you know, hey, look, here's a tooth, and by the way, you have teeth too. Oh, great. That means that we have some kind of category in our minds about what a tooth is. That means that we can that means that it has a nature, and natures like Aristotle would just say this. So since teeth are biological, they would have an intrinsic telos as opposed to an extrinsic telos. That's something like the knife would have from your earlier example. And we can tell what an intrinsic telos is by just observing nature. That's like the kind of empirical side of teleology, I guess. And in nature, teeth are used for like, ripping flesh and grinding food and, I guess berries and all that too, but you get my point. And so that's why it would be in accord with our nature to use our teeth to like bite food, and it would not be in accord with our nature to hold a smartphone with our teeth.
I see. Okay, no, I really appreciate you clarifying that, because yeah, that's I'm going to go against Aristotle here and say, yeah, I disagree with him on that. Maybe that's really scandalous. And you can see, I think, where he kind of got his influence from Plato in the sort of like forms and things. That's very interesting. Yeah, because I think this idea that everything in its own has its own kind of nature, I would be very skeptical of. Like, what is, like, how do we know something has a nature by itself versus it's just either an accident or came about by like natural selection or something like this? It maybe there is no necessarily design plan for every little thing, or no inherent nature. I would also be skeptical, and I would deny that we could get this sort of ought just by observing happening in nature, because I would argue this is like trying to get an ought from it is like, this is the way things do behave, but how do we know that's the way they ought to behave just by observing the way it behaves? How do we know that it's the case that this is in accordance with its nature or not? I think those are the areas in which I would be skeptical. So I would be skeptical of Aristotle's whole nature thing.
I mean, me too, right? Like, I'm not, well, I guess I'm not a moral realist at all, but I'm also not even like a realist about natures and stuff like that. So I'm a nominalist. So I think that only concreta exist. I don't think that any abstracta exist. But that is the way that Aristotle and Aquinas would have thought about it, is that all natures have, it really, I should be saying forms. Natures are generally the forms of organic things. So all forms have some kind of final cause. And a nature is just a final cause for an organic thing. And generally speaking, we only consider organic things to actually have like moral, like moral agency. And that's why, like we generally don't talk about like the nature of a knife. We would talk about the form of a knife, but we would talk about like the nature of a human instead of the form of a human. I mean, you could say either one, but yeah. So I share your skepticism, and I think this is gonna sound like so rude, but I think the whole thing is hogwash. Like I just think that Aristotle was wrong on like almost every front. And it's funny too, because Aristotle wrote about a lot of this stuff as physics. Like, he never used the word metaphysics. Aristotle only, like, he wrote a book called Physics, and then everything after he published the book called Physics was called metaphysics, because it's just what comes after physics. So Aristotle thought that he was doing natural sciences, and that's why the book that I'm reading is it's titled The Unnecessary Science, because Aristotle thought that he was doing science, and I think that it's just primitive science. Like that's all that teleology is it's primitive science. And it's not correct. And there's not actually four causes. You know what I mean? I just kind of think Aristotle, so like, it's hard for me to even like articulate like where I disagree with Aristotle. It's kind of like, well, geez, where do I even agree with him at all? Like, I think it's like disagreements all the way down.
It's so funny. It reminds me, I saw this meme and it was like, man, the Greeks, like, everyone thinks they're smart, but it was just because they said a lot of stuff like first. Like, it's like, I could have come up with a lot of this stuff, just made up a bunch of stuff too. It just they just happen to do it first. Everyone thinks that they're really smart about it. I do think, yeah, perhaps where I do think Aristotle was onto something, in the sense of thinking about purposes and sort of design. And that's, I think, even something that epistemologists now kind of look into, like, when can we trust our like faculties of reason or our sense faculties? Well, when it's operating in an environment if it's operating in a well-functioning environment. Like, yeah, if I take LSD, I may hallucinate things, so I shouldn't trust my senses in that case, because I've like taken something that undermines them functioning in accordance with some sort of like proper, I want to say proper functioning, but these are all loaded terms in particular. So yeah, maybe I would not go as far as Aristotle, and I'd be very skeptical of how far he takes it. But maybe I would say, yeah, I think he was on to something when he thought about the idea of purpose being important to morality, of the idea of like, hey, like, how can we know how things ought to be without knowing like what they're for and who gets the authority to say what these things are for? And I think that being the sort of like design, like if I built a house for the purpose of, you know, housing people, and I made each room like 4 feet by 4 feet. It's, I think people, arguably, it would, I don't want to say objective, but maybe reasonably objective, that anyone could look at this and say, hey, like this, given your purpose of designing this house to like house people, each room is 4 feet by 4 feet. So you can't even fit a bed in there. So in accordance with your stated goal of creating this stuff, you have done a poor job at executing this particular goal. And I think that's maybe as far as I would take the teleological piece. I don't know if there's necessarily like an end that it's like progressing to, other than the end that I set out for it to be something to house people. But then we can kind of rank like, okay, well, let's say I create another place to house people and I make, you know, these bigger rooms, and each one has a bathroom, and I've structured the plumbing in a particular way. Then I think people could look at this, even if they didn't know me, that even know that I designed this stuff. They could look and be like, hey, this is a great place for people to live, because it's in accordance with its goal of like being a livable place. So you can kind of, once you know what the purpose or what the goal of design was, you can then kind of evaluate it on those particular terms.
Yeah. So, you know, it's funny. It's like, I really don't disagree with anything that you just said, because I'm fine with talking about things serving the purpose that we intend them for. I don't think it, like if somebody said to me like, you know, hey man, I tried to make bread, but it came out like really bad, I wouldn't be like, what do you mean bad bread? That's nonsense. Bread doesn't have any kind of intrinsic purpose. Like I would be like, no, I understand that, like, you know, it had too much salt in it or something, and bread is not supposed to be salty, or, you know, whatever. But where like Aristotle and Thomas and stuff like that come in, so they wouldn't agree with me and you right here. And so I've got a question for you related to, like, I want to see how Thomistic you are. And there's no right or wrong answer here. I'm just looking for like your opinion. So Catholic Thomists like Ed Fazer would say that contracepting is wrong, like in any way, shape, or form. Like having marital relations with your wife without and there's like no polite way to say this. Like you should be trying to get her pregnant every single time, and if you're not, that's immoral according to like the Thomistic tradition. And they back that up by saying like the purpose of those organs is procreation, and so if you're using those organs for anything other than procreation, then you're misusing them. Now, it does get a little bit more complicated than that, because they will say that they actually have a dual purpose, those organs, not just procreation, but also union. But then somehow they smuggle in, but it's only union between married people. Like you can't use them to form a union with somebody that you're not married to. And that really, because marriage is an artifact. Like Aristotle, never mind. And also, they will say, by the way, wait, it's actually not immoral to use organs in ways that are simply not in line with their function. It has to be actually opposed to that function. So they'll say, for instance, what is the function of your hands? It's for grabbing stuff. But when an acrobat, and this is actually from the Summa, like Thomas's big tome,
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when an acrobat walks on their hands, are they sinning? Because they're using their hands for a function other than grabbing stuff. They're using their hands to walk. Is that a sin? And Thomas says, no, it's not a sin. Why? Because according to Thomas, you're not doing anything to your hands that make them incapable of grabbing things. You're just kind of using them for some other purpose. Like, sure, you're not grabbing anything in that moment, but that's fine. You don't have to be grabbing things at every moment with your hands. You just have to like not chop off your hands, because if you chop them off, now you can't grab anything. So chopping off your hands is bad, but walking on your hands is not. You may already be drawing some parallels between that and the procreation thing, and being like, wait a minute, but you're not incapable of procreating just because you contracept one time. And I'd be like, yeah, exactly. So I'm just interested to get your thoughts as a non-Catholic. What did you think about that whole kind of thing?
Oh, that's such a good point, because honestly, I don't know where I like stand on the whole. Well, I don't want to say I don't know where I stand on contraceptives, but I think I understand the thrust of the Catholic argument that says the purpose of marriage is to have children. And I think this is one of the reasons, for a moment, I think it's so difficult now to even define marriage, because you have people who say, well, marriage, what about child marriage? What about polygamy? Why do we get to draw the line between some things and not? Who gets the right to say what marriage is for? That would be my argument. If we don't know what marriage is for, then how can we say one form of marriage is more legitimate than another without having like this like goal or idea in mind? So that's like one particular thing. But I think the difficulty that I have with contraception, at least like with the banning of contraception, is one could argue that one of the purposes of sex is the like union, or is the pleasure part of it. And in that particular case, is it like, how do we know that sex is only for the purpose, the only for the purpose of procreation as opposed to anything else? And I think this is where a lot of Protestants will argue that no, sex has like this union piece or this other thing. However, where I do find maybe the Catholic argument compelling is the argument that when sex is used outside of its intended purpose, it leads people to go against their nature. It's not they're misusing. It's not that the sex part is wrong. It's that they're using other people as means to their own end, which is their own pleasure. They see other people as like sexual objects for their own gratification. But of course, I mean, I guess you can imagine people that are, in some sort of friends with benefits kind of situation, and they just both mutually agree either that they're going to be using each other or that they won't. So I guess I see both sides. So I don't know if I'd necessarily put a hard line on that either way, but I totally see exactly where you're coming from. I think my skepticism would be, how do we know sex is only for marriage? I think traditionally the consequence of sex was having children, and in that particular case, it may. This is like an interesting like logic connection that I would make. But maybe if you take the Bible as prohibiting sex outside of marriage, this is because God knew that if a man and a woman had sex only for the purpose of having pleasure, the woman could just be stuck with the kid and the man isn't having to necessarily commit to her. So it's because of the bad consequences that God sets the purpose of sex and or marriage to be a specific way. And that would be where you could possibly get the design from. But yeah, I don't think personally I would make a really strong argument either way, because I think you could make a case in either circumstance. I realize for Catholics, contraception is off the table. But I think I understand the point of like, well, aren't there other benefits to having sex? Say a couple they have enough kids and they just want to have a union. Yeah, I would just need to read more about. I know there's like that was it Pope John Paul II who wrote the thing on that
yes,
on contraception. Yeah, I haven't read it.
The name of the encyclical is escaping me. But yes, I'm pretty darn sure that was Pope St. John Paul II. Yeah, so like you said, like if according to Catholic theology, if a married couple has 7 children and then they want to still have their marital union without procreating, they are only allowed to use natural family planning, which is to say like track her cycle and then, only have their union on off, when she's not ovulating. And that's it.
Go ahead.
And I was just going to say like, and I find it so silly that you're like allowed to track your cycle and like, cause like, hey, you're not technically contracepting, like you're not doing anything, but like, what's the difference between you tracking the days and then having sex when it's, and I'm trying not to say having sex because I'm trying to make this YouTube friendly, but when they're having their marital union on days when she's not ovulating, like what's the difference between that and then putting a layer of silicone between you and her. Like, what's the difference? Like, I don't see a difference.
Yeah, and this was something that I was very like confused about, because I'm like, if somebody's using natural family planning for the purpose of planning out when they have marital relations so they don't have a child, isn't their like goal of this in the same way as like somebody using like, a latex contraceptive? Like their goal in each case is to not have children. Now, is it true that Catholics think if you're using NFP for the purpose of not having a children, it is sinful because you're like?
So it depends. So Sede Vicante is a sometimes commenter, and so Sede, I imagine that you're a Sede Vicantist, right? And that's a whole other thing. We don't have to get into Sede Vicantism, but that would mean that he is probably even more like trad than I was growing up. And so I think Sede is saying that like no, any use of NFP is always sinful, always, whenever. But to answer your question, most Orthodox Catholics would say that indefinite use of NFP is sinful. NFP is only okay, you've had 2 kids already and you're gonna have a 3rd kid. You just want to space it out a little bit because the budget's a little tight. Fine. Use NFP for 1 year, then stop and have another kid. And if your goal is just, I'm never going to have kids, I just want to use NFP for my whole life, that would be sinful, according to Catholic theology.
But using like a latex contraceptive would not be allowed in that circumstance where you've had 2 kids and you're planning on having a 3rd. Okay.
Correct. Yeah. So if you just want to space out your kids, you've already had 2, you're going to have a 3rd, NFP is fine. Latex is not. A pill would not be. Anything that, like any kind of insert would not be. Nothing would be. And the general idea of it is that you are not allowed to take actions that would frustrate the end. But like if the end gets frustrated, but you didn't do anything to cause it to get frustrated, then hey, you're in the clear. And so if you're just utilizing the body's natural cycles and you just so happen to only be having your marital union when it's impossible for her to get pregnant, well then, hey, no harm, no foul, which I honestly kind of think is hilarious. Like, I really do think it's funny. Like, it's straight up funny to me. And I know it's not funny to a lot of Catholics, but as somebody who took this very seriously at one time and now kind of stands from the outside, like I have a chuckle.
Yeah, and I think that would definitely be the case where I'm like, how is NFP really like different? And there are other things too, like people cite Onan in the Bible and what he did as sinful. And yeah, that's such an interesting question though, because my argument would almost be along those lines where like if the purpose of sex is only procreation, then NFP and any other sort of thing is kind of abusing that end. But that's under the premise that sex is only for procreation and there maybe there aren't any other secondary or other sorts of benefits. But I also understand the hesitancy to go so far in the sex is for pleasure direction, because I also am concerned that's like I could see the Catholic view that would be like twisting the sort of purpose of it for something else. And there could be some, potentially there's also negative consequences, even if you're not a consequentialist. There could be negative consequences to this. Or perhaps the reason you could argue that if you're a Catholic, God created sex for this or said sex was only in these particular things is because using it outside of these purposes leads to negative consequences. Could be potentially a way you could make that particular bridge there. But yeah, that's such an interesting question. Yeah, I guess I just don't know where I stand on that. I mean, that's what you get talking to like a Protestant who hasn't really ever considered or knows that much about Catholicism, and just kind of, people use contraceptives all the time, and it's very relatively uncontroversial, I would say, at least in this day and age. I realize 100 years ago that was not the case, but I guess nowadays.
Are you familiar with any of the like scholarly work that's been done around like just the whole story of Onan?
No, I'm not actually.
Um,
That's really interesting. I didn't even know that was like a thing that people
well,
were commenting on. I'm
so,
sure.
so I guess what do you? I'll ask two questions. What do you currently think the sin of Onan is, and then what were you told the sin of Onan was growing up? And go ahead and be vague. I'll know what you mean.
Yeah, so I think the response that I've gotten primarily from like the Protestant side is that Onan was not doing his duty to have a child with his wife when he had an obligation to her. So it's a very local situation. It's like,
Yes. Okay. That's not how I learned it growing up. I learned that it's a sin because, like, the very act of spilling the seed is what is sinful. Like, context be darned. Who cares about context? Um, it's all about the spilling the seed, which I didn't learn until like after I was already not Catholic anymore. That there's all this context around the story, and it's actually way more about the fact that Onan was cheating his deceased brother's wife out of an heir to which she would be able to give her widow's, like her dead husband's inheritance, because Onan wanted to keep all of his brother's inheritance for himself. So I didn't realize all of that.
yeah, and the interesting thing too, it's like I don't even think most, at least from my experience, most Protestants even like really talk about this story all that much. Like we definitely didn't talk about it in like Sunday school. Like I had to like look it up when I was reading about the Catholic view on contraception and be like, well, how do Protestants interpret this passage? And then I read it. I think most kind of just, maybe, but you're right. That would be the standard Protestant answer would be, yeah, in this particular context, you're right. He's cheating her out of having the money. I think, yeah, like there's exactly what you said.
I think what it is women didn't own anything back then. So she had a dead husband and she had no son to give the inheritance to. So the inheritance was kind of in limbo. And if she died without ever having a son, his younger brother, the dead brother's younger brother, would get the inheritance. But it's his obligation to give her an heir so that she can give that inheritance to her son rather than to her dead husband's brother. But he didn't want some spoiled, rotten kid to get all of his brother's inheritance. He wanted to keep that inheritance for himself. So that's why he wasn't giving her an heir. And so it's like, what's the problem here? It's being selfish and trying to kind of steal your brother's inheritance away from his widow.
Exactly. And I think in this particular case, you could even make a teleological argument that like, if God was like angry in this particular circumstance, it was because he was using the withholding of sex for a purpose of like not giving her what she was owed or something like this, which is, yeah, very interesting. But yeah, that's I think the interpretation that I would definitely take out of that if I was to take that in context. But exactly, that's
I've got one more kind of morality question for you, and then I'm happy to kind of take this in a different direction if you want. But so are you familiar with Dave Paulman's work? And the reason I ask is because he's the moral skeptic, but also still a Christian. And so I guess whether or not you are familiar with his work, can you imagine a morally skeptic Christianity?
a really good question. I think. Well, let me say a few things. First of all, I don't think I'm familiar with his work at all. I would be very interested if you guys have any resources or recommendations to check it out. One of the difficulties on this comes for like, what do we mean? I had to talk about this in my class. Like, what do we mean by a Christian? And I'll admit that I draw the line at probably like the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed. Like, you have to believe, like, because there are people that consider themselves to be Christian atheists. Like, yeah, I love Jesus, I just don't believe God exists. I believe, but I would say it's definitely not an orthodox type of Christianity. So for my purposes, and I realize it's kind of an arbitrary line, but for my own discussions, I usually use the creeds as this. So I think where I see the possibility of Christian moral skepticism, I don't think you can be a Christian moral skeptic, or let me put it this way. I don't think you can call yourself a Christian and deny the reality or the objectivity of sin. And I think if in that particular case, I would be very skeptical if somebody who calls themselves a Christian but believes that sin is either a non-real thing or an emotive like an emotive kind of thing. That's, I think, where I would draw the line. But if somebody wants to say most of our moral judgments, they're an anti-realist about like morality as we describe it, but they still believe like sin is this kind of objective thing. And I could understand a Christian interpreting sin as, you know, a distortion of God's plan. There are lots of ways one can like see sin. One can see it as like the absence of God, or a deliberate, like, I guess, rebellion against God in these particular things. But I could understand that somebody could be a Christian moral anti-realist, believing that maybe God has like a certain idea of sin, but God is kind of an emotivist. Like, this is God's desires, but that doesn't really make it objective. But at that particular point, I would argue it almost becomes a definition game, because I would say if morality is grounded in either God's nature or God's commands, then I would argue that's just one really small step from being a realist and just saying, well, God is the kind of ground of any sort of fact. So if one's a realist about scientific results, but they're grounded in God's nature or God's commands, yeah, they're like dependent on God. So, and you could argue that makes them arbitrary, but that at the same time, it seems weird if it's relative to, you know, if it's relative to just each other human beings, that's different than being like relative to God as either the ground of being or the creator of the universe. I think that is like a little bit a different kind of thing. So I think it depends where that moral skepticism ends. Is it a skeptic or an anti-realist about sin and any sort of moral obligation? Would somebody like this really, I think it's difficult for me to see somebody being a Christian and saying like, yeah, somebody who murders their neighbor hasn't necessarily done anything objectively worse than somebody who chooses to not murder their neighbor. I think I'd be skeptical, but I haven't heard the argument, so I don't know.
Yeah. Here's something that kind of occurred to me. And this is I'm going to use a Catholic example, so I might need to ask you to like come up with a Protestant example. But so Catholics would say that it's a sin to purposefully eat meat on Ash Wednesday. Ash Wednesday is a day every year where Catholics must abstain from eating meat. It's under penalty of sin. So if you purposefully eat meat on Ash Wednesday, that's a sin. But is it immoral? I could see a Catholic saying, no, there's nothing immoral with it, but it's still a sin. And I wonder if there's anything there. Like, I wonder if a Protestant could be like, no, there's nothing immoral with just not attending church on Sunday just because you don't feel like it. It's a sin, but it's not immoral. I'm trying to put on my religious hat here, so I might not be doing a very good job. But do you think I'm onto something?
No, that's a really good question. And I think part of me wants to say, like, what makes something immoral is that it kind of is a sin. I'd be curious to see where that distinction was. If somebody wants to claim something can be immoral but not a sin, or something can be not a sin but still immoral, I would be curious what their symmetry breaker is, or what methodology they would be using to define these terms differently. I think in theory, I could potentially see a few options, but it seems to me the main problem with, if you're a Catholic, not eating or choosing to purposely eat meat on Wednesday is that you believe this thing is, you're doing something that you think is wrong for the purpose of your own either gratification or for some other reason. But if you do believe it is a sin, then I would argue that makes it immoral, because you ought not to sin. Like, what makes something bad is a prescriptive ought not to do this thing. And what makes something good is you ought to do it, or you ought to behave this particular way. So I would argue if it is a sin, there seems to be some sort of prescriptive or obligatory nature, like to avoid or to try to avoid doing it. So if you're purposely continuing to do it, I would be inclined to link morality to a moral judgment to that. Maybe I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah. And let's not rehash the whole is ought thing. So there's one more topic that I want to discuss, and that's just music, because I've seen all the keyboards in the background of your videos. But before I move to music, did you want to add anything else about morality? Like, did you want to kind of like, we talked mostly about teleology with morality. We really didn't talk a whole lot about gastronomic realism or anything like that. Did you want to do anything else in the realm of morality before we jump over to music?
Maybe I'll ask like one or two questions, and then
Yeah,
I'm really excited to talk about music. So, are you a moral skeptic or a moral anti-realist? How would you like define your moral view?
anti-realist.
Okay, so and are you like a sort of non-cognitivist or oh, what's the other
I
one?
might be an emotivist in the sense that um, like so I struggle with these sometimes because I don't think that, for instance, like I don't think that when you say you think that murder is wrong, you're just saying boo murder. Um, but I think that that's what I mean when I say it. You know what I mean? So we might have different ideas about what it means. But I'm an anti-realist about it all anyway. So like I don't think there is a fact of the matter about what morality is, and so like I think that when I say murder is wrong, what I mean is boo murder, and what I think is when other people who are moral realists say that murder is wrong, they mean to intend something. They mean to intend a fact of the matter when there is no fact of the matter.
That's okay. Yeah, that's a good point. And it gets into be interesting, right? Like because I'm of the kind of persuasion when I meet somebody who's a naturalist who claims to be a moral realist, I am assuming what they're saying is they think they're expressing a fact consistent with their epistemology and ontology, but they're actually expressing like what they mean by this is something different because the words good and bad are fundamentally incompatible with their ontology. That's kind of like the way I would sort of read into that particular thing. Here's kind of another question. Sorry, I don't mean to just kind of
No, I like
bombard
it.
you, but I will. So, do you think only is statements can be factual? Do you think it's possible that an ought-based statement could be either objective or a factual statement?
I think that ought ifs can be factual. So, if you want to win the chess game, you ought to capture the opponent's king. I think that's a factual statement, but I don't think that just you ought to capture the opponent's king. I don't think that any plain old ought statement is a factual statement.
So okay, yeah, this almost gets to be a very like technicality based argument. But suppose you believed that God existed and created humans for some reason. Would you then think that it's possible for an ought based claim to be objective in a similar way to an is-based claim being objective? Like if God laid down, like God decides to create the universe according to some particular set of laws, and that's how we get, say scientific facts. God also creates stuff with an intended mental purpose. Would an ought-based claim about how humans ought to behave in your view, if God existed, have a similar level of potential objectivity?
I would still think that ought statements aren't factual, even if God did exist. The ought if could be like, if you care about doing what God wants you to do, you ought to do what God wants you to do. Or perhaps even if you want to avoid hell, you ought not to sin. Sure. But what if somebody just wants to go to hell? What if they think that hell sounds great? They love the idea of being tortured for eternity. And so they're like, yeah, I'm just going to, I'm going to, do all the things that you would say I ought not to do. But he's like why ought I not do them? I want to go to hell, So I don't think that God actually solves the Azot problem. That's kind of how I see it.
So I don't want to say I came to a similar conclusion, but I have this paper, I put it on Phil Archive called 5 Challenges to Sort of Naturalistic Secular Moral Realism. And it's my sort of 5 questions that I think naturalists who claim to be moral realists need to confront. And I'm not necessarily, I do think theism has an easier job of answering these questions, but that's not really the purpose of that paper. My paper is just to point out what the big hurdles are for naturalism in particular to answer, and why it's especially difficult, in my view, for naturalism to account for moral realism. And one of the things I talk about in the paper is all moral concerns will eventually come down to sort of practical reasons. Because somebody some kid asks, well, why ought I do what mom says? And they say, well, because you should listen to what your mom says. Well, why should I listen to what my mom says? Because God says you should. Well, why should I listen to what God says? And you can keep asking these questions and, going back and back. And that still doesn't necessarily get you an answer. But I do believe that these moral questions eventually end in sort of practical concerns. Even if that's not necessarily where the moral grounding is. So somebody may decide, yeah, why ought I care about what God thinks is right for me? I would say, yeah, you technically don't have to. I can't give you a logical reason per se, but I can't give you but I can give you a practical reason, or perhaps God does give you a practical reason. Like, hey, look, if you do want to go to hell, that's great. You can like have the result, like God's obviously, in my view, like very distraught about this, but yeah, you're free to like have your cake and eat it too, if that's what you'd like. And it is, what it is. So there is sort of a practical reason to follow it in the end at that particular way. But I think sort of like statements are difficult to do this too, because somebody could say, well, why ought I care that gravity exists? Like if I step off a building, I'm going to fall, but why should I care about that? It's like, yeah, it's a fact that gravity exists. You can choose whether or not you care. You can't really give someone a reason to care about like factual matters either. It's just kind of, it is what they are. And I think I kind of explore that a little bit in the paper. It's kind of an interesting thing, because I think in the end, whether you're an atheist or whether you're not an atheist, when you ask somebody why they don't do something that they like, why they don't cheat when they could obviously get away with it, like why don't you cheat on your test when you could get a better score and increase your utility? I think both the atheist and the theist, and perhaps the agnostic, are going to say, because I really do believe it's like wrong or bad to cheat. And it's not because they're afraid of hell. It's not because the atheist is necessarily like, I don't even know what you'd say. But I do believe like even the atheist who is particularly like a moral anti-realist, who still chooses not to cheat, who may admit that, yes, I am being irrational because I am choosing, or superstitious because I'm choosing to follow principles that I don't believe actually exist. But there's still like, I don't know. It just seems like there's still something there that's grounding their decision. And I don't know what the heck it is, but it's not just self-interest. I think that's the point I want to make. People generally don't appeal to self-interest. Some people do, but most people, when you ask why they do or they don't do things that we would assign to morality, it tends not to just be self-interest. Perhaps that would be the point that I would say.
Yeah, I mean, humans are social animals, right? So humans have like very deeply instilled instincts to do what's good for the tribe, not just for the self. And so I think that a lot of the like, should I cheat on this test, comes from a like, geez, do I want so I'm in med school, should I cheat on my test? Do I want doctors operating on me who all cheated on their tests? Like, maybe not. So maybe I shouldn't cheat either, because I would want to be a good doctor. And if I'm going to fail, I should fail honestly so that I relearn this stuff next semester and then I become a good doctor instead of becoming a bad doctor sooner. I think that's where a lot of that stuff comes from. And that's cool. Like I'm on board. And I do think that people would cheat. Like if I gave you a test full of arbitrary questions and I said like, I'm going to, shoot you in the head if you get less than a 75% on this test. But by the way, you can cheat. Like you'd be like, heck yeah, I'm going to cheat. Like, and like, if the question, like it's arbitrary questions, like it's not important for anything. It's just, you should cheat and you should not feel bad about it. You know what I mean? So that's kind of my thoughts there. I think that a lot of the like the moral intuitions really just come from, humans being social animals.
Yeah, I totally. Have you ever read this great book, Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind?
No, I have not.
Oh, it's very good. He talks about it's an interesting book. He talks about sort of like he's a moral psychologist and a naturalist, and he talks about this, and it's very interesting. There's another guy who's a sociologist who wrote kind of a response to that book and to Sam Harris called Science in the Good, The Tragic Quest for the Foundations of Morality. It's by sociologist James Davison Hunter and philosopher Paul Nielewski. Great book. And he kind of, what these people do, what they basically do is they argue most people who are writing about morality are actually moral nihilists, but they don't admit it, and they kind of smuggle, they misuse these terms good and bad to kind of refer to these general vaguely humanistic things, but they don't actually believe these things refer to anything meaningful. And as a result, they are kind of, I don't want to say lying or being misleading, but it is like, it's an interesting argument that's basically saying like they're not being entirely forthcoming and honest about the fact that even though they're talking about morality, they no longer believe these things. Basically, like you, it's a byproduct of evolution that doesn't track any sort of true things at all. That's really what they believe. So when they talk about these moral things, they mean something different than what people think they mean. It's kind of an interesting set of books. So for people who are watching, if you have any free time and want any interesting reading recommendations, I would recommend those 2 books.
Cool. Any other questions for me? I'm actually enjoying being in the hot seat. I like it.
Oh, really? Oh man, I would need to think. I guess one question, like, how would I say this? If you were to be a moral realist, would you be a virtue ethicist, a deontologist, or a consequentialist?
Almost definitely a virtue ethicist, but that's not fair because I grew up Catholic. And
I see.
Catholics, by and large, are like virtue ethicists. So,
Oh, maybe I'll ask another question. Yeah, I'm just having fun here. What would it take for you to become a moral realist? What would convince you?
yeah. So, like, if we found the moraliton, the fundamental particle of morality, I'd be in a heartbeat. Now, that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek because I don't think that any moral realists actually think that there is a moraliton, like some fundamental particle of morality. But some kind of empirical evidence would absolutely do it for me. Us engineers, we tend to be empirically minded. I'm no exception. I'm very much so empirically minded. And 1,000 years ago, there's no way that I would have believed in waves and stuff like that, and fields or electricity for that matter, if we're going 1,000 years ago. But I do believe in those things today because we have empirical evidence for them. And I don't think that we have any empirical evidence for morality. And I think that most moral realists are like, yeah, of course there's no empirical evidence for morality. That's not the kind of thing for which there would be empirical evidence. And my response there is like, that's fine. But I generally don't believe things unless there is empirical evidence for it. Like down to the point where like I hold some downright strange views, that like we could get into them. But like the number one way to make me a moral realist would probably be some kind of empirical evidence, whether that would be a moraliton or something else. But that would do it for me for sure.
But I feel like that's tough too, because like let's say you like got a strong enough microscope and every atom had written on it in every single language, it is wrong to like kill babies for fun. I don't, would that still convince you that morality was objective? Or maybe it would convince you that these words were there in the universe?
No,
it would.
It wouldn't. Sometimes people like to be like, oh, if the stars rearranged themselves to say Jesus is Lord, I would not believe it. I would believe it in a heartbeat. I'm not so proud that I can't admit that I am like, come on. If we zoomed in on every single atom and every single atom had written on it somehow in every single language, and just the concept of anything being written on an atom makes no sense at all, because written how? These are subatomic particles that we're looking at individual protons. Anyway, and like, but if somehow it was written on every single atom, I would believe in a heartbeat, and I wouldn't feel bad about it. And so would everyone else. And everybody else who tells you otherwise is just being proud. They're full of it. I'm convinced they're full of it. Like, that would be incredible. People ask me that, like with the theism question, they're like, what would it take for you to believe in God? And I frustrate them all the time because I'm like, well, a Damascus Road experience would do it for sure. And they're like, wouldn't you just be like, well, I could have just been hallucinating? And I every single time I'm like, I would absolutely not say that. Like, I am not so proud that I think that if I had some kind of like I would, there are ways to convince me. Like, I don't think that I'm like, I'm not like the Matt Dillahunty kind of person where I'm like, because I think that Matt Dillahunty has said things like, if somebody like chopped somebody else's head off and then they prayed to like, in the name of Jesus, I put your head back on, and then like it reattached, like Matt Dillahunty said he still wouldn't believe. I would absolutely believe if I witnessed something like that. That would be insane. Like I can't imagine not believing. So anyway, that's like, just call me a fool, but I don't care. I would believe.
Here's an interesting point I'll say, and then I'll stop. If I was to say like what would convince me of being a moral anti-realist, and I'll admit I was a moral skeptic and a moral anti-realist for actually a pretty long time. I think for me it would actually be a fundamental change in my subjective experience with morality is what it would take to convince me to at least not be the sort of leaning moral realist side. That's a weird thing to say, but I do find that And this is some of the work it actually has to do with some of the research that I do, but some of the work by people like David Chalmers and who's that guy? Thomas Nagel and I guess Heidegger to a certain degree of like the sort of subjective first person experience and like whether or not that like what knowledge comes from like a subjective experience. I think if my fundamental like subjective experience changed, or empirically if and there would need to be a lot of work that would convince me of this, but I think I would definitely become a moral skeptic and less of a moral realist. Maybe I wouldn't be a complete anti-realist, but I would definitely be like on the skeptical or agnostic side if there were like really compelling empirical studies that showed that natural selection could and with high probability select for specific moral cognitive beliefs like moral beliefs and religious beliefs. Like if this was not just like we have these explanations of how it could have happened under the assumption of naturalism, but like here are like assumptions under naturalism that show this and this and this could evolve and do evolve with a high probability. I think that would absolutely convince me, or at least severely weaken like any case I had for like theism or moral realism by creating like an undercutting defeater for that. A pretty strong one, I would say.
Yeah, I hear you. Do you want to do music?
Yeah, let's do music.
The reason I ask is Anton is very excited, and Anton is a not just a pianist, but also teaches music. So Anton is very well versed in music. So I take it you play keyboard.
I do. I'm not the best live player. I do a lot of production, and I've been DJing for about maybe like 12 years now.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
It's a lot of fun. I do like weddings on the weekend. I do some club events and a few festivals, but the festivals not as often as I would like to, but mostly like clubs and weddings. Weddings are good money, and then clubs and college parties is just like fun. It's just wild.
Yeah. I like festivals. Now, you might not play the kinds of festivals that I go to. A lot of the festivals that I go to are like rock style festivals and stuff like that. Like I was just at Moon River Festival in Chattanooga, Tennessee. That was a few months ago. That was actually it was September, so a couple months ago, whatever. And most of the stuff that I play, I think most of the time people can see the guitars back there. It's all rock and blues and mostly rock and blues. That's cool though. When you DJ, do you bring the gear behind you, or do you generally bring like that box on your left? The
box on. Oh,
the pad.
So that's actually like a drum machine. So typically when I DJ, I would use like sometimes I'll use actual turntables with a mixer, although no DJs that I know of, or very few, actually use like real vinyl that they cut their music on. What you use instead are what are called control vinyl. So it sends a control signal to the mixer, and so you get the feel of vinyl. It actually picks it up through the needle or through the motion of the turntable, but you're actually just spinning a digital file on your computer, and that's what's coming out of your computer sound card. But you still get the feel of like an actual turntable. So that's typically what I would do. And I'm what's called like an open format DJ. So I play a lot of different genres of music. So I'll do lots of Latin, hip hop, pop, and then some electronic music, some EDM. When I produce music, and you can see these, all these keyboards, I do mostly electronic music, but I've done some orchestral, and I tend to do like mixing and mastering and production work for other people too. So this keyboard is a Virus TI2, very popular synth in trance. I have another TI2 on my desk, and then a Roland JP8080, and this is the Novation Ultra Nova, and this is a Yamaha Modi X. So all of these are like they're all digital synths, and they're all very well known in the genre that I do. And I don't use them that much because I'm kind of lazy and I like doing everything in the box with the software. But occasionally it's fun to take these guys out and play around with them and tweak them and everything.
I love Roland, and I have my heart set on a Roland electronic drum kit, like the TD17 KVX or whatever it is. My brother has one / had one. I don't remember if he sold it to get an acoustic kit or if he sold his acoustic kit to get that kit. And And I used to have a really crappy little electronic drum kit, not from Roland, and then I played his, and I was like, oh, this is what an electronic drum set is supposed to feel like. So I'm a big Roland fan. I don't actually play drums. Like, I can mess around on the drums. I primarily play bass and guitar, but I like Roland, and so I'm definitely gonna get myself a Roland drum kit one day.
Do you ever like record the music that you make? Do you ever kind of like do any like the production stuff?
So real production, no. But I do like record songs and I do like mix it myself, and it's generally not very good. But the little intro that I have to most of my videos now is me. Actually, most of the intros to most of my videos have been me. For the past little bit, I've had a like this one intro, and it's just acoustic guitar. So if you watch like any of the videos that I put out over the past few months, the little jingle that you hear in the beginning is me. It's a super simple little, I don't even remember what I did. It was like a super simple little descending lick, and I think it's a couple suspended chords. Yeah. So I don't even like particularly remember what I did, but I understand theory a little bit too. Like I took AP music theory when I was in high school. And I can't read live to save a life. But if you give me sheet music, I can figure out what's going on. I just can't like play it on the guitar, because like the guitar is like not a good instrument for like reading sheet music anyway. But I'm fluent in the language. So like if you told me like, oh hey, like, you know, you want to come jam, like this is gonna be in the, you know, we're playing in the key of F, and you know this is like a, you know, a 1-3, you know, 6-5 progression. Like, just can you keep up? I could be like, yeah man, like, you know, I'll keep up, and I could play. And yeah, like I used to be in like jam bands and stuff like that in high school. So I don't play as much as I would like to anymore. But I record a little bit. You would like laugh at the software that I use. Have you heard of Mixcraft?
Yeah, I have actually.
Okay, I use Mixcraft. So what do you use to mix and master?
I kind of move around quite a bit, and some of it, it's like if an artist sends me a project, I'll typically mix it in the software they send it to me. So I got very good at mixing in Logic, just because I used to work with some artists regularly that do. I'm actually not a fan of Pro Tools very much at all, but that's not really surprising because I work with MIDI a lot, and Pro Tools, great for audio, but not that great for MIDI. I primarily use Ableton Live. Sometimes I use FL Studio. And when I teach music production, I've actually gotten to teach this at university. I tend to use Studio One. The people at Studio One have been very good for giving us licensing for the class, so everyone gets a copy during the semester to mess around and play with it on their own. And Studio One's really good. I think some of these digital audio workstations, they get so bloated with all these features, it just becomes overwhelming. And Studio One has a lot of features, but it's not. To me, it's very intuitive. But Ableton Live is really good. FL Studio's, if you're doing any audio work I don't really recommend it, but if you're primarily doing electronic music, it is very fast and very good. So those are pretty much the ones that I've used, and I continue to use, and I've been doing it for probably over 12 years now, like production stuff.
Wow, okay.
So it's just, you know, I'm just so, it's like one of those things, like it's hard for me to even teach it now because it's just so second nature to me, and it's hard getting in the headspace when I'm teaching it. Like, what do you guys not understand? Like, what is hard? You know, like because it's just like it just comes to me. Like, I know the keyboard shortcuts and everything, and I'll like catch myself teaching a class being like, oh wait, you guys don't know what I just did.
That's funny. And you know, you can shame me for this. I deserve to be shamed. I have a license for Ableton that I haven't done anything with, because at my last job, I worked with somebody who had a brother who worked for Ableton or something. And he saw like my computers behind me, like on a video call for work. And he was like, oh man, like you record? I'm like, yeah. He's like, what do you use? I'm like, Mixcraft. He's like, oh man, you want an Ableton license? And I'm like, I guess, yeah, why not? So he gave me an Ableton license one day, and I just never, I think I redeemed the license through the Ableton website. I think I even like downloaded the Ableton software. And I don't think I ever actually like opened Ableton. I still just use Mixcraft.
I think what you would like Ableton for, my guess, is if you were to like put some like drums together, even if you were to get your Roland, and you could kind of like live loop different things and play the guitar and play the bass and sort of structure your song like in almost like a non-linear way. Like you just record your bass loop and then you have that playing, you pick up your guitar and then you're actually like playing with it. It works really well for doing things like that. But hey, if Mixcraft works, like you should keep, use what you're familiar with. Like,
Yeah, it's not like I'm doing anything real, you know what I mean? Like I never even like write like full songs. Like everything that I write is like, because I can't sing to save a life. So everything that I write is like hey, I can write a verse and a chorus and a bridge, and then I don't even bother writing lyrics because I don't know how, and because even if I did write lyrics, I wouldn't be able to sing them anyway. So, and then it just dies. The project is just like, hey, here's a collection of verses and bridges and choruses. Yay. And that's it. So, I love guitar, but I miss having a band because there's something that like happens, like there's some kind of like magic when you put three different minds together and they're all working on the same song instead of just like, at least I feel this way. Like, I'm able to riff off of other people's ideas, and when it's just me, it comes out worse than when I have other people helping me. Obviously, right? but yeah, Mixcraft works. I like it.
no, I know exactly what you mean because I used to be in jazz band for a number of years, and I would probably still do it if I had the time. And if I play saxophone as well, I've been playing that even longer than I've been doing production. And it's so cool in jazz when you take turns doing solos and you hear like what people are improvising over the chords because it's so organic. And I find like I love electronic music because it's so produced. It can be so calculated and so almost formulaic. And I think to my engineering brain, it's a very like comforting thing. But I like the fact that jazz can be a little like unpredictable, and I miss kind of the improvisational aspect. But I think I've gotten good enough at doing all the parts. I had to learn, like you were saying, like I had to learn how to program percussion, but I can't play the drums, but I can program in like different percussion loops. Or I can, if I'm writing for like an orchestral score, I actually have to think about like, is this a reasonably like, can a violinist actually move from this note to this note like quick enough? It's fun like thinking about that when you don't play it, but it is different when you actually get to hear like the real instruments and stuff. And it's like just something different and fun about it for sure.
So I don't actually play drums. Like if you told me to play Back in Black by AC/DC on the drums, I could do that. Anything more complicated than Back in Black, I'm probably not going to be able to play. But what's funny is that I'm somehow worse at programming drums than I am at playing drums, which I generally isn't the way that it is. But like I don't know. I've never actually like sat down and like learned how, like when I program drums, it comes out like AC/DC every time. You know what I mean? Like it's not advanced. And I guess there's only so much time in the day. I feel like I've spent most of the last year and a half on YouTube, I guess. Not enough time actually learning how to program drums. In my next life, I'll learn how to program drums.
You got to check out this piece of software. I don't know if there's a way you can download a demo. It's like, I think it's by TuneTrack. Is it like Ultimate Drummer, Superior Drummer, and Easy Drummer? Man, this thing is so cool. You can just have it do these, it'll like kind of drum for you, and you can have it do all these fills and stuff. It is insane. I like doing it when I'm like lazy. I'm like, oh, I want to have like a metal drummer on this track. And you can just have it do the style, it'll set up the kit, and then you can just basically like choose which patterns and which fills you like. And it is different than like sometimes when I'm just doing electronic drums, which frankly, like I'm not the most like, I'm not the best drum programmer. There are other producers in my genre who are very good at both programming drums and then also doing drum synthesis. Like, how do you create drum sounds from just like basic waveforms and shapes? And I've done a little bit of that, but there are some people that are really good at like programming the drum using like, oh, we have like this is a second order Bessel function because this is stretched over a two-dimensional plane. Like these people are nuts. Like they are nuts, but I love it. Like,
yeah. That's like a whole new level that like, I would have no idea what I'm talking about when it comes to that stuff. That's a whole new like world for me. But well, Cool, man. Hey, I've kept you for like an hour and 40 minutes at this point. I've got one final question for you, unless go ahead and add any adding stuff at the end. But where can we find you?
Oh, that's a good question. So you guys probably know I have a YouTube channel, Thinking Christian. I also have a YouTube channel, DJ Meyer. It's DJ MYR, where I teach people music production related things. I have a couple of classes. You can see some of my released music there, but some of it I can't upload there because the record labels will copyright me. And it's just because of the algorithm there. I've had very good experience with the record labels I've worked with, so I'm not complaining about that. It's just the YouTube algorithm will copyright it. So look up DJ Meyer if you want to learn about uplifting trance music production from a very technical standpoint. Like cool. It's like a very niche thing, but people are very good. I've noticed this. You guys will find this funny. I upload a video there, and it can be like me just noodling around on like different synthesizers, and I'll get all these comments that are like, "Oh, thank you so much. This is so helpful," and I love it. It's really great. And then I upload a video to like Thinking Christian, which I think is like some really well thought out exploration of ideas where I try to be fair. And then people in the comments are just so nasty. I'm like, oh my gosh, like it just goes to show, but you kind of get it. When you're talking about music production, people can very easily tell you're like trying to help them and trying to teach them things. Whereas when you're really challenging their fundamental questions about how reality works, I think some people take that as a threat. So I do get it. It's just a little sad.
The duality of man.
The duality of man, exactly.
Awesome. And then Paul, any kind of note that you wanted to end on besides where we can find you? And if not, I'll ask one final question.
I think that's it. I'd love to come back if there are any other topics you want to discuss or anything.
Hey, I would love just to do like general theism with you at some point too. But I guess question for you to end on is what are you, and specifically regarding the Thinking Christian channel, what are you working on next? Or like what's the next project, the next script that you have in mind for us?
Ooh, good question. Like for us two to talk about?
No, not for us. I just mean for us, your subscribers.
Oh, I see what you mean. Oh, that's a good question. I want to add, so I have this playlist of videos, like arguments for God and arguments against God. And I'm just trying to sort of be exhaustive. And what I want to do is I want to find more arguments against the existence of God that I can present on the channel. So if you guys know of any, let me know. And I'm trying to formulate a few that I'm like trying to rework. Sometimes I'll look at Alex O'Connor's channel and there are ways I can take some of his ideas and rework them into like a more, because I try to use like formal arguments, like a formal logical, like modus ponens or something like that. So I'll try to do that. But that's kind of been one of the projects I've been trying to pick back up again, is like really try to be able to present them in the most fair way possible and not provide my own thoughts like too much on it. Or when I do, be very clear about where I'm saying like where it is, but try to just be like a more like neutral resource. Cool.
Awesome. Well, Paul, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you again for responding to my video and for doing it in a insightful and thoughtful, but also respectful and not just a look how big of a dummy Kevin is kind of way. We need more polls on YouTube and fewer people who do the whole toxic response culture thing. So thank you again for coming on. It's been an absolute blast. This has been Kevin. This has been Conversations with Non-Catholic Christians, and until next time.